Hi, thank you for joining us for today's panel. My name is Marion Patricio, and I help lead UCLA Ventures, the university's largest hub of alumni entrepreneurs, founders, and venture capitalists. The last few months have been challenging for all of us. It's been particularly challenging for many of our founders and their startups. As we've talked to the entrepreneurs in our group, we've noticed that many have pivoted into the pandemic. The founders that we have on our panel this afternoon not only sensed a business opportunity, but an opportunity to help end the pandemic. It's entrepreneurship at its best. So we thought we would take this opportunity to have a conversation about what the last few months have been like for these companies. To start, I will go around the room and ask each panelist to tell us about their business and how the business changed or pivoted in response to the pandemic. Let's start with Gabe Richman, CEO and co-founder of C19.ai. Gabe, can you talk to us about how OMIC has tailored its platform to COVID-19?
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabe Richman, founder and CEO of OMIC. We've created a new kind of operating system for healthcare that's powered by biomedical data science. We help healthcare providers divert patients from preventable risks, and we enable researchers to perform AI-driven therapy design and precision drug patient matching. Now, when the pandemic hit, we opened our technology to the research community at C19.ai to bring researchers together and to use our tech in an open COVID-19 AI research consortium. We partner with a number of organizations like the National Scientist Volunteer Database, and the community is producing some tremendous research to shortcut the pandemic with science.
Nice. Thank you, Gabe. Next, let's turn to Mikhail Briman, CEO and co-founder of Proxim Diagnostics. We're really excited about what you're building at Proxim. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure, I would be absolutely happy. That's what we are building. This is our portable analyzer, and this is our portable consumable. So what happened, Proxim started as the next generation point of care platform, and originally we were wanted to be in the emergency rooms, and we did focus on the classical tests that are done in the emergency rooms, like troponin for heart attacks, procalcitonin for sepsis, and so on. Recently, we've been working on the for the test called IL-6, interleukin-6, which is actually we working with collaboration with one biopharma giant. And what happened, and it is purely by accident, that the test that we are developing, especially for the interleukin-6, is actually a predictor of the COVID-19 severity. So there have been recent data and emergency use authorization, for example, from Diagnostics, that actually shows that based on this this test alone, you can predict the chances of the pretty much dying of a person of COVID-19. So because it's thought that overreaction of the immune system is the key to the COVID-19 outcome. So, so basically, I would say for us, COVID-19 impact was mostly positive because a lot of interest to our platform, both from U.S. government and from other players. But there have been negative sides, of course, too. We can talk about this later. So.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Albert Cha, managing partner at Vivo Capital. Albert, you're the lone venture capitalist on this panel, and I know you and Vivo have done a lot of work thinking about an investment strategy for this space. Can you talk a little bit about that and about your perspective on the virus itself? How has the virus affected your approach to investing?
Sure. So I think that when January and February hit and we saw COVID spreading through China, we had general concerns about it going global. Our fund actually has multiple vehicles under management. One is devoted to private companies, another is devoted to public companies. So we made some tactical adjustments because we were concerned about the spread of the virus, which unfortunately came to pass. In terms of Vivo's portfolio, both in terms of existing as well as potential investments, we've had some investments already in spaces in diagnostics and vaccines that had the ability to address COVID. And so obviously, it's part of what we try to do as a firm is do well by doing good. In addition, we actually looked at making new investments in companies, again, developing therapeutics, vaccines, and businesses that would potentially benefit from an increasingly remote monitoring world, whether that's telemedicine or other ways to help manage patients with diagnostics don't require patients to go directly to the office. So I think it covers a lot of different spectra, but what I would say just in general is I think we're excited about the prospect of vaccines coming. Hopefully we'll have some approved before the end of the year. And the early data is certainly promising. So we need to get those through clinical trials and get them out to the community.
Awesome. I'm glad you mentioned that you're working with telemedicine, because the next two panelists are also working in that space. So now we'll hear from Dr. Murisiku Raifu, the CEO and co-founder of Talamus Health. Muri, can you tell us about Talamus Health and how COVID-19 has created an opportunity to expedite the trend of telehealth? You're muted right now.
It's quite interesting because we always kind of saw telemedicine as sort of an adjunct, and I still believe that telemedicine is not going to sort of be the be-all and all solution to healthcare. I think it's a very important part of it, but it had never really gotten to play the kind of role it could have played up until COVID came. So COVID kind of accelerated it. It's kind of been playing almost like the black sheep of the family on the side for a while, and now it's sort of front and center in everything. So for us, we've always had telemedicine as part of our platform, because our platform is really structured around this idea of federated and decentralized approach to medicine, centered around the patient experience. And that is, the patient should be able to get what they need quickly and have access to it, be able to pay for it, be able to do those kinds of things very quickly in a very centralized way. And wherever they are, if our platform is functional, they should be able to plug into that system quickly, which is not the case now. Most patients actually have to kind of fit into whatever is there, as opposed to the system kind of bending to their needs, which is really the principle. And telemedicine is a very important part of it. Now, when COVID started, obviously telemedicine, having it there really helped us. It actually had sort of a negative in one way, in the sense that a lot of our clients had to shut down temporarily. A lot of the hospitals, that were basically, or clinics, basically were not going to, because nobody knew what was happening. Patients were afraid to go to clinic. But then we quickly turned around and actually helped them start to leverage telemedicine to try and do their work. One of the things we had been doing also was trying to help insurance companies. Just for the audience, we function mostly on the continent of Africa, and trying to help insurance companies go digital. And telemedicine then became part of the claims platform we were kind of using for them. So they were able to marry their claims system with telemedicine at the same time. So it opened up new opportunities. There were conversations we were having with some governments that had been slow, and those picked up as well. So it's been a mixed bag for us, yeah.
Interesting, thank you. And finally, we have Sri Gondi, president of Cooey Health, an AI-based platform that focuses also on telehealth and remote patient care systems. Sri, can you talk to us about the company and how COVID has affected your business?
Sure. I'm Sri Gondi, president of Cooey Health. Nice to be here. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
My journey for Cooey Health started with a very basic need. I just wanted to track the health of my parents back in India. So that's how it started. And I went around looking for telemedicine tools that could help me track the health of my parents. Couldn't find it. So we started as a small project. And long story short, today, Cooey Health provides these telemedicine services in several countries. We operate in 4 countries right now. So we came to the US early this year, right before the COVID pandemic hit. Our basic vision is to be able to enable anybody with a smartphone anywhere in the world without any dependence on economic situation to be able to access basic healthcare, have continuity of healthcare. So that was our vision all along. And so we mostly serve underserved communities in the US, even before the COVID pandemic hit. And as you may realize, the COVID crisis has actually made the situation in underserved communities even worse, because the healthcare access in those communities is really poor compared to urban areas. We cater primarily to the rural areas, underserved communities around the country. We started our operations in Florida. When we started, it was about remote patient monitoring, virtually engaging patients, bringing a lot of patients who were previously not on healthcare onto the platform so that doctors could continuously monitor their health and so on. After the COVID crisis hit, all the doctors and clinicians scrambled to figure out how to continue to provide healthcare because patients could no longer come into the clinic anymore because they were scared, especially in the months of March, April, May. People were really scared about coming into the clinic. And a lot of these clinicians were able to leverage our platform to be able to stay connected to their patients, especially the serious patients, and still be able to provide some level of care so that their health condition is stabilized. Right? So the COVID crisis has gotten us to add features and functions that will help patients also track, screen for COVID, for example. If they have any COVID symptoms, for example, we actually provide tools for them to track their condition so that they only go to the hospital if it is needed, for example, right? So we have one of the most sophisticated COVID screening tools on our platform that our patients use right now. And that is one tool that doctors use to kind of decide when the patients need to go to the hospital. So that's how we have adapted our offerings and platform to help patients get through these times. And we hope to make it more and more useful to customers going forward.
Nice. So before we get into sort of the challenges and stuff, I think some of the audience members are curious to hear what it was like for your company internally when the news of COVID hit. I know it came slowly for some people. Other people kind of predicted it early on that it was going to be what it was. But how did your companies react, and how were you able to mobilize quickly? And this is open to everybody.
Yes. Good.
I don't know. Sure. For us, is initially it was a lot of countries basically went into lockdown. So everybody just were told to go into lockdown and stay at home. And unlike the United States, where you can kind of over there can be quite draconian. So we had to figure out, first we have to make sure that our workers are safe, and trying to figure out how do we get PPEs, because PPEs were really, really not available in the countries. So we had to figure out how do we secure and make sure that our our employees who are getting out there trying to meet doctors, trying to do stuff, were actually safe. And so procuring of PPE was the number one thing we tried to do. The second thing we did was to now get in touch with our existing clients to try and figure out how they manage it, because a lot of hospitals, again, went and closed up. Clinics and hospitals basically closed up right away, trying to kind of get in touch with the right people and trying to see how can we help them in the process. And then the next phase is to look at what is government doing and how can we participate in the process, and also looking at organizations. So we did a lot of webinars, for example, for doctors early on about COVID. That's getting experts to actually talk to them on Zoom to educate them about COVID, because a lot of doctors just simply didn't have enough information. So we turned into sort of an educator organization again, and we devoted some of our resources because our people just couldn't go out there to do anything. So we found ways to kind of, again, use that opportunity to build relationships as well. As opposed to just having our people sit at home during the lockdown, we leveraged Zoom a lot to kind of communicate, organize webinars, do all those kinds of things.
We saw much of the same thing we saw the pandemic coming relatively early, and we're certainly concerned about it. And one of the things that happened early on in the pandemic is there was a surge of people saying, I'm stuck at home, how can I help? I want to do something beyond just socially distancing. I want to actually get in and help. And the wonderful thing is that a lot of those people are clinicians, doctors, nurses, scientists, chemists. We had a wonderful group of people really interested in doing something, actively participating in ending the pandemic. And so our technology wasn't geared toward infectious disease or viral viral pneumonias or anything like that, but we decided we were just going to open it all up to the community and let them have at it and see what type of research they could perform and contribute back to the community. They've done some really phenomenal, interesting things, all the way from predicting how information and good versus bad information will spread in an uncertain environment like a pandemic, sort of that metadata, all the way down to the detailed biomedical information, like how do we take the actual viral strain, how do we take the code of the virus and use that to predict whether or not a patient is going to have a good or bad outcome, above and beyond using things like age and comorbidities and the host factors. How do we actually look at the virus and understand how we can differentially treat patients and keep them alive? And so the community's been performing just some really wonderful research. And that's really what our belief is, that the community will get us out of this problem that we're in now.
Well, in our case, it was probably the craziest 1 month from February to March, where we were thinking what is the best way how we can help, because our platform can do so many things. So shall we just continue with IL-6? Shall we develop tests to detect COVID? And shall we scale up manufacturing? And there've been really a lot of talks with U.S. government, because we were recognized as one of the most promising platform in terms of being able actually to, in the end of the day, telemedicine and all algorithms are fine, but you need hardware, right? We're a hardware company that actually detects COVID or predicts the COVID mortality and this kind of stuff. And so it was very, very busy month for us with a lot of talks with FDA, with US government, with BARDA, with National Institute of Health, like what is the actual, how we can help given our stage. And a decision was made to actually gear toward scale up of manufacturing, because at the end of the day, whatever you do, there are a lot of patients, and that's what we've been diligently working for last several months. And now we're expanding the test menu. So we'll be probably working not just on IL-6 as they predict mortality, but also looks like COVID testing is here to stay. So as Albert mentioned, there's a lot of interest to the remote settings and how to test it in all kind of communities. Our platform is portable, and we can do actually quite sensitive detection as well. So we're geared toward doing the whole portfolio of the COVID-related products, but not only necessarily COVID, because flu season is coming and RSV infections go up. So how we distinguish between COVID-19 and flu? So that kind of stuff. So overall, it's a lot of pivot toward infectious disease, and not just for COVID-19, but also the future pandemics and predicting how severe they are and this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Sri or Albert, do you have anything to add?
Yes, sure. March, April, we were in the remote patient care business before it hit. Now we had to adapt the business model to the new situation. First of all, how do we help our existing medical clinics and clinicians and doctors still maintain the continuity of care with their patients? So, of course, we were providing that care right before COVID hit, but how do we adapt it in the COVID times? So one of the big things, challenges we faced before the COVID pandemic was doctors in general were not very receptive to telemedicine, or the whole ecosystem was not that receptive to telemedicine. It's less than 10% of the market at the time. But I think the COVID pandemic brought in an urgency for doctors and clinicians to adopt this, because you don't have a choice, because the patients are not coming in. So you have to maintain the continuity of care. So it forced, it created a forcing function, if you will, for clinicians to adopt telemedicine to have the continuity of care. And I think that that's the silver lining in this whole thing, is that it kind of forced everybody to get on the bandwagon of telemedicine to some extent. At the same time, the challenge was to protect, the clinical staff, especially when they engage with patients in this time. How do you actually protect them? So, especially in the first few months, the challenge was around the logistics. How do you actually have that interaction? Because some of the clinicians in our staff or our medical center staff go to patients' home because these are seniors, 85, sometimes even about 90, who cannot come into the clinic. You have to go to their home and provide the care. And how do you ensure that you don't put the patient at risk, you don't put your employees at risk? That is a challenge, and it continues to be a challenge. And that's something that we keep figuring out and getting better at it as we go along. Thank you.
I think at that first month, really, when we went on lockdown in Northern California, was probably the busiest of my career. Probably the unbusiest in terms of travel, but in terms of the amount of information that was coming out and trying to understand how a virus that was in Northern California circulating in January, because the cases were already occurring, and yet didn't spread like what we were then starting to see in Europe and then on the East Coast, was a puzzlement. And so the amount of information that I was reading every day till late at night, coming up on preprint servers, not published information, trying to puzzle through spreading patterns in terms of therapies that might work, remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, obviously rapid testing, super important. And then most importantly, other therapeutics, antivirals, anti-cytokines along the lines of IL-6, which Mikhail talked about. And then finally, vaccines has just been just a crazy amount of flux, but more importantly, the things nice to hear about across all the folks.
Okay, thank you. And then I wanted to have each of you talk about, and some of you have already sort of mentioned this, but what was one of the most difficult parts of the last few months since the pandemic hit? One of the biggest challenges?
Well, I can start there. As soon as the pandemic hit and we went into lockdown, if we were talking with primary care providers or healthcare providers in general, they were experiencing a difficult time, and their IT departments didn't really have much to talk about except for telemedicine, as it became really substantially important during that time. The same with research or pharmaceutical companies, where there was a tremendous focus on getting drugs and vaccines to market that are related to COVID-19. And so there's just this immense pull directly into COVID-19, and anything that is not core to that becomes out of the field of vision. And so at OMIC, that's why we really moved into providing a research community at C19AI, was to help to address that, and then also to sort of stay relevant during these times.
Well, in our case, it's definitely the biggest challenge was how to stay focused. So just because in the end of the day, pandemics come and go, but we would like to think we're here for the long run, and how to basically pick from very, very, very different opportunities that come, that appeared, which is great, but it's also how not to spread ourselves thin. So that was it's a nice problem to have, but it's actually not an easy problem. So that was our biggest challenge. We didn't have any other challenges. We are exempt as a biotech company. We obviously have all PPE, so so we didn't necessarily had any kind of operational challenges. A little bit, but not much, really. So all our vendors are also, biotech exempt. So So it didn't really affect us operationally, but in terms of how to actually be productive and provide the greatest impact, that was not an easy task for us.
We had a bit of two kinds of challenge. One was, again, as I think Sri and Gabe both alluded that there was this pull towards telemedicine. So we had now new physicians who were ready to get onto our telemedicine platform, but they're used to people coming holding their hands and really teaching them how to use the platform overall, not just the telemedicine part of it. And we couldn't get our people out there to do it. So we had to really pivot and learn how to do a lot more remote, because they were very resistant to remote onboarding. So our teams really had to figure out how to do remote onboarding efficiently in a way that gets people to be able to do stuff. And then the other problem we had also, where there were people who were already sort of in line. For instance, insurance companies that we're talking to, they all went home and were shut down. So those conversations kind of stopped. Right now, we are beginning to start those conversations again. So parts of our business kind of came to a halt just because we couldn't go to follow up and sit down and have the conversation to get them on board what we were trying to do. And on the telemedicine part, people were interested, but we had to figure out how to now teach doctors who really, to be honest, I'm a doctor myself, so I can say this, like to have their hands held when it comes to some of these onboarding stuff. How do we get to do it in a remote fashion? We're able to get some success with that, but not as much as we wanted to.
Okay. I'm not sure if Sri has.
Yeah, sorry, my video icon got stuck here. So I'm just going to talk about it. One of the big challenges where we came across was to give confidence to doctors that, this would work, the telemedicine aspect would work. And they all knew that this is, they had to do it because there's not much of a choice. And so they were willing to work with us and make it work in general. And especially when you have the patient pool that we have, which is about 60 years mainly, the risk of bringing them to clinics is so high, especially back then. How do you actually interact with them who are actually not generally comfortable downloading apps and setting something up? How do you actually get them to come online without taking a risk? That was a key challenge in terms of logistics for us and for the clinicians that we work with. And it took us a while to work through that. So.
Yeah.
I think for us at Vivo, we had to make sure that the companies whose procedures required patients to see physicians, suddenly their procedures went to zero. And so we had to make sure those companies were financed to be able to survive what we knew would be a potentially protracted period. But sometimes there were opportunities with that too. Actually, one of our women's health companies actually was able to make an acquisition of a product line and get it at half the price as what they were planning to pay for it because of what had been happening with COVID, knowing that there was risk, but also knowing that the one good thing about healthcare is that people still need healthcare, even in the midst of COVID. And so I think that that's the one silver lining about our industry that I think is the silver lining.
Okay, and I actually forgot to mention at the beginning that we will have a Q&A portion towards the end, the last about 10 minutes of the conversation. Feel free to send any questions throughout and we'll just kind of try to get through all of them at the end. But now we'll move on to, so Mikhail, you mentioned that you're working on this project. A lot of you pivoted into this project, but at the end of the day, your business needs to survive sort of past this. So how do you simultaneously build a company that is addressing this era that we're living through, while also thinking about what the company might look like after the pandemic?
Well, again, we stayed focused. So in a way that, for example, IL-6, that test for cytokines, it was before the COVID, and it is something that will be used regardless in the biopharmacological trials. And basically, we didn't run immediately into the temptation, oh, let's develop the COVID antibody test, because we knew that every major diagnostic company would be doing that regardless. So how we're going to compete with Roche Diagnostics or Abbott or Siemens Healthineers, right? So we are adequately funded by the biopharma companies and other industry partners. So so the only change that we decided to make is to put more emphasis on manufacturing, which we have to do anyway. And once we achieve that milestone, then we can think of then we'll know much more about COVID, which we do. So, for example, now when we develop a COVID-19 test for remote settings, and we already know all the biological reagents, we don't have to do much R&D. So we kind of took very disciplined approach. So we kind of for several months we pretended it doesn't exist. Okay, so for us, and then now we capitalize on all the knowledge that's already available. So there are companies that got plenty of emergency use authorizations for COVID testing, and we feel pretty confident we can do better. And so far, and that actually would be my one question to Albert later, we don't know if the demand for testing would stay as high as it is now, because it kind of goes down, vaccines coming up. So a lot of people say it will stay through 2021, but there's still debate. But regardless, in our case, so okay, we're funded, so we just be discipline focused, and lets others to take the first bullet, so to speak. So that was our approach.
Just to answer that, I think testing will be here forever. I think this virus is going to circulate in the community, unfortunately.
Okay, good. That helps in our risk mitigation, because we did have this discussion, shall we even spend our bandwidth for the development assay, because what if tomorrow there will be 100% efficient vaccine, right? So
no. I mean, I say not going to be 100%. It's harder to get immune responses in older patients, so you're going to have a vulnerable population. It's not clear how long immunity lasts, and so redosing is going to be possible. And then most importantly, there's just going to be times and situations where you need to know if you're infected or not. So unfortunately for the world, but the good news is from a testing, we're going to need those tests indefinitely.
Yeah, and that actually helps a lot of our company, because now we can say, okay, well, number one, we can predict if the severity of the outcome of COVID-19, cytokine release syndrome seems to be the best predictor. And number two, we can actually test for COVID itself quite sensibly. So that's so we'll see. We'll see. But so far, just staying focused was our best. That's how we survived. So I would say.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts? Sri, I think you might have missed the question, but I was just asking about the sort of the future of your the businesses that you're building, and how you simultaneously build a company addressing a pandemic that, while also thinking about what the company will look like post-pandemic.
Yeah, a good question. There's a lot of uncertainty around the businesses, right? Especially when you have to have a touch point with patients on the ground. This becomes a very risky proposition. Just to give you an example, just one of our employees this week was diagnosed with COVID, right? So she was on the front lines, and it was not, something that she got during the course of work, but when she was with a family or so, she acquired it, and abruptly she had to be taken to the hospital and be at home, right? So, and I can give you other examples where patients who have come in contact with our clinicians were diagnosed with COVID like a couple of days after they were in touch with our clinicians. So the reality on the ground is that it is so risky to have that touch point on the ground that it creates a lot of unpredictability for us. And how do you provide care to these patients who need it, but still protect either side, both the patients and our clinicians? And that's a real challenge. I wouldn't say that we have solved the problem. I think like all the panelists have indicated, that this problem is there to stay. but how do you actually, manage this ground reality, if you will, when people have to interact with people to provide care, right? It's one thing for us to be able to do things in the background, but when you have a touch point with the patients, it becomes a real challenge. How do you evaluate the risks and take care of everybody here? So yeah, I think solving that problem is one of the big things on our table right now.
And just to write on what Sri said, I do think a more distributed and remote monitoring approach to healthcare has to be a big part of the solution. And that is, if there's an opportunity to reduce the number of leverage technology to reduce how many touch points you have with the patient, then it's better. So a patient, for example, who just underwent spine surgery, for example, and you've seen the patient a couple of times, they really want to come back for a follow-up to look at their image, of whether the fusion has taken or not. You can essentially, if they're doing well from your last visit, they don't really have to come to your clinic for you to be able to actually discuss that with them and show if everything is going fine. The patient should be able to do remote, meet you remotely. You can send them the order, they can get the MRI, and nowadays there are tools to be able to actually look at the images online and be able to come up with a plan with the patient, refer them for physical therapy and all those kinds of things. So a more distributed, decentralized way of healthcare should be really where everything should be moving towards the future, so that unnecessary visits are reduced. And it's also overall for the healthcare industry is actually good because it's less burden on the patients. I have patients who come to see me an hour out. I'm talking, they're coming from Inland Empire, drive all the way to see me only for 15, 30 minutes of discussion, and then have to drive through traffic again all the way back, when really honestly, some of these patients could have easily been done through telemedicine and had those kind of conversations. So I think the future will have to really, and there are many issues that come into it in terms of payment, all those other issues, the regulations and all those kinds of things. We need to really look at those things all over again and make this remote telemedicine component a vital part of healthcare. I'm not saying that everything can be done that way, but I think there's a chunk of it that can be done that way, and that to reduce the footprint. And one of the things about this virus that makes it very worrisome is the fact that you can have asymptomatic patients who are just shedding this stuff. And that's the issue, right? You have a patient who's asymptomatic, they come to your clinic, and by the way, not to mention all the people they will interact with on their way to your clinic. I used to live in New York City. Most patients would take a subway to come and see a doctor. That means everybody on the subway could potentially be getting it, in addition to the staff at the clinic where they show up. So really, we really have to really think this is I think a huge opportunity for healthcare to really, really look at not only just the interaction between doctor and patient, but also regulations. And with regulation also comes issues around payment, because often regulations are tied to payment. So we have to look at all of that across the board, and the lead should come partly from the government, because obviously everybody tends to benchmark everything they do against Medicare and all of that. And therefore we have to start really looking at this seriously.
Yeah. Gabe or Albert, do you guys want to chime in?
Sure. I think to a lot of the panelists, I completely agree. The pandemic is here to stay, unfortunately. It creates a tremendous number of challenges across industries, but certainly in healthcare for the reasons that were described. For us, we temporarily pivoted our business entirely to altruism. Whether that turns out to be a good business model in the long term, we'll find out, but we felt compelled. We felt we had to do it. And so now that we're coming back and ramping up the commercial side of the business again, we'll have to adjust to this new environment. Remote work makes it difficult. Remote sales certainly makes it difficult. There are a whole lot of ways in which we're going to have to change our businesses going forward. Even working among a high-performing startup team that is now distributed. I was historically a huge proponent of everybody being in the same cramped space and just practically bumping into each other when you get up to get a coffee. And now we're adjusting to that remote environment in a whole new way. for all of our own safety, thank goodness people are doing that. And yeah, I'm in agreement. There's no silver bullet in this case. There are going to be a lot of lead bullets to solve this thing.
Nothing to add from me. Thanks.
Okay, so next I wanted to talk a little bit about venture capital funding and what that's been like over the last 6 months. Have you seen any new challenges or new opportunities for funding? We can start with Albert. You can talk about the funder side, and then anyone can chime in about your experience fundraising.
Yeah, so I think one of the hardest parts is in today's world, obviously, when we back company management team, it's hard to do diligence in person now, right? And so in particular, I think making investments in companies privately where you really want to have a chance to spend time with the entrepreneur, it's much harder. It's not impossible, but it's harder. And so as a result of that, I think financing processes are taking more time. And certainly when the pandemic really first went viral, no pun intended. And by the way, I think that one of the things we figured out early on about, I highlighted this earlier, I think that D614G mutation that occurred in Europe actually is what made this thing really deadly. It didn't start out that way, but I think that's what made it global. And that didn't come out until later. But I think that at the beginning, everybody, shell-shocked. And so it was hard to pull the trigger on new investments when we didn't know exactly what was going to happen. But actually the public markets, at least in biotechnology, have been surprisingly resilient. And so as a result of that, the good news, at least in that segment of the market, is that there's robust appetite, there's funds available, and people are making investments still. And so there's actually been lots of IPOs, again, at biotech at least. And so that financing availability has actually enabled companies to continue to be financed even through the pandemic in a way that I would not have predicted. But I think it's probably in part because biotech is such a focus, obviously for solutions for COVID-19, that I think it's gotten the public's attention, and that's actually it's been a good thing.
Yeah, I can chime in. Yeah, we are in the pre-seed stage, so at that stage, it has not been an issue for us to be able to raise funding on the good side. But on the other side, from a market standpoint, when we are on the ground, we do see that there is a widening divide between having accessibility and not having accessibility, especially based on economic situations and social conditions, right? Somebody asked me, what do you see is the biggest risk for the next couple of years in our communities? My answer, based on what I'm seeing in rural areas and underserved communities, is social unrest. If this pandemic is continuing to go at the rate it's going, and things are not taken care of from the point of view of these rural communities, underserved communities, it is going to not be good for any of us, right? For the whole broader population. So that's actually weighs heavily in my thought process, and I'm sure it weighs in investors' thought process as well. That's my 2 cents on that topic. Thank you.
So in our case, we got lucky that we got funded by biopharma giant last year. So we actually didn't have to fundraise. So again, speaking about being focused, for us, we basically decided on purpose. Yes, there are a lot of opportunities to fundraise during the pandemic because of our company, right? So we can, but in the end of the day, we did want to make sure that there's a very clear milestones that we can achieve. So we on purpose done zero fundraising until recently. So unfortunately, an answer is I don't know, right? So, however, we'll figure out pretty soon, because for us there will be again decision if we want to continue go with getting money from the potential strategic partners that almost always comes with option to acquire, at least in our industry, versus getting independent capital from the venture capitalists, and we'll see how that this not being able to meet in person and all other things are might affect our business. So that's we're kind of excited to figure this out in a month or so.
Go ahead, Gabe.
Oh, sure. Thank you. From our perspective, we haven't been looking for funding during the course of the pandemic outside of grant funding. We've noticed trends in grants going mostly to universities with near-term solutions, and so not so much for core long-term research for really impacting the pandemic now. There's some rapid programs to do that. In terms of venture capital, angel, private equity in general, and Albert would be the best person to talk to this, but I've seen a trend that investors are putting money into their existing companies, their portfolio companies, to just make sure that they can weather this pandemic, because it could be a protracted period. And so we've certainly seen that type of a trend as well.
And just to add to what Gabe said, yes, definitely, I have heard from a few quarters about the decision to double down existing companies to make sure that they're able to weather the storm in this time. For us, we have been raising, and we've had some success, but we're not done raising yet. We're still in the middle of raising. It's just taken longer than we had anticipated because of the COVID, because it was just a few months where, again, like Gabe said, it sounds like everybody just hunkered down, tried to sort out what they have existing. And now I think investors are beginning to come back up for air and kind of start looking at opportunities again. So what we found is that there's been really a delay in the response rate than we expected, even though people have stayed interested. So for example, we had a group that we spoke to, and we didn't hear from them for a good almost 2 months. And then all of a sudden they came back. It's like, let's talk, let's go. So it is that. And like for those 2 months, we're like, what the hell is happening? So point being, it's just been, and understand like some of these investors are themselves internally as an organization are also trying to organize themselves, right? Because of the COVID, because the COVID also affected them. There are people whose families may be involved. Who knows what's happening with a lot of these organizations. So I think to some degree, the sort of everybody was in shell shock, and they had to figure it out. They had to double down, make sure the existing companies were doing fine. So in that sense, it's just, it needs a lot of patience on our part to kind of get through it. So
I can confirm what everybody has said. You fall into that camp.
Nice. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the Q&A. We have a couple already. Feel free to send any more, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. First one, Albert, you can start with this one, and then anyone else can jump in to answer. But can you tell us more about the near-term potential for therapeutics? Do you expect them sooner than vaccines?
Yeah. That's a great question. I will do my best at prognosticating. I think, unfortunately, the therapies, the only ones that we think may show good promise in the near term are the anti-GM-CSF antibodies, but they haven't proven themselves yet. The anti-IL-6s, as Mikhail knows, have not worked. And the antivirals, the only one we have is remdesivir, and it's given intravenously. There are lots of companies trying to develop orals, but those are going to take longer to get on the market than the vaccines. So I think the vaccines actually will be the front line of defense, which actually makes sense because given how readily this is transmissible, we have to get as much herd protection as possible for the population.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to jump in? If not, we have a few more questions.
Sure, I can add on to that. I'm encouraged by the therapies that are coming out, especially just drug repurposing. For the purpose of symptom reduction and mortality reduction. So not necessarily for completely solving the pandemic, which a highly effective vaccine has the potential to do. And there are 5 or 6 different approaches to developing those vaccines and over 100 candidates. But for the very near term, we need to get very smart on how we're treating patients at different timelines, different time points in their disease. And whether it's to combat a cytokine storm, whether it's to try to ventilate them at the right time in the right position, we need to find more effective ways of keeping people alive and sharing that information. And there are therapies like remdesivir that have shown some potential for benefit and are being used in different ways. Things like dexamethasone, heparin are being used for different purposes, and we just need to understand the disease to a better extent and really create the right guidelines for how to treat at what time.
Yeah, I would like to add that in my opinion, the answer is I don't think anyone knows yet, because what actually happening, like we're having still to date a very intensive conversation. Can you measure IL-6? Because regardless of Actemra failure, still predicts the chance of dying independently of anything else. In parallel, can you measure quickly the marker called procalcitonin, PCT? That's for the if you have a parallel bacterial infection as in addition to COVID-19. Can you measure so-called D-dimer that basically shows that there's a coagulation event in the blood and you are going to have micro clots in the in the bloodstream? Can you measure troponin for heart attacks, because there's a propensity of the severe COVID-19 patients to actually experience heart attacks or heart failures? So basically the answer, as Gabe mentioned, I don't think there is like one therapeutics. COVID-19 is a tricky one, so everyone can experience it differently. And the answer is like, well, we just have to use, and might be what's killing in the end of the day, at least in some patients, not COVID-19, but whatever it triggered, right? And then you have to be ready and use traditional therapies and make sure you monitor a patient appropriately. Is it heart attack or clotting event or heart failure or something else happening? And then adjust the therapies that actually exist, but you have to know what to use and when.
And the extra challenge is that some of these therapies can cause side effects based on other things that are also concurrently happening. So if you find a D-dimer, for example, you decide, okay, we're gonna, you're worried about microclots, you're gonna start doing heparin, and somebody suffers a stroke, which you know is a thing, there's a potential for breakthrough bleeding into that stroke because they are anticoagulated. So the really big challenge with this thing is it kind of hits you from so many places. And I still believe that ultimately trying to get herd immunity through a vaccine is what's really gonna prevent us from being able to deal with this. Because when people
just to get herd immunity, that's what might end up. So, looking at Sweden, right?
Yeah, I mean, not the way Sweden is doing it, obviously, but but in a controlled fashion, in a controlled fashion, you know. So
it's old-fashioned, right?
Yeah.
The experts have spoken, so I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one more question. With so many people infected globally, we seem to know relatively little about the virus, transmission, and immune response. Is there a good public source for accurate information? Are there different strains, and is it mutating? That's a lot of questions in one, but feel free to answer any of them.
Boy. I don't know that there's one source of public information, but I would say, CDC is probably a good place to start, generally speaking. The virus has mutated, and I provided my perspective. I think that D614G mutation in Italy made this thing much more infectious, not more deadly, but it increased the transmissibility ratio. And I think the good news, though, is that at least based on some of the preliminary data that's come from patients, the mutation is not going to prevent the vaccines from working, at least for most people, the vast majority of people. But that said, we're just going to have to continue. It's probably going to become a seasonal vaccine, and we're going to see additional complications with flu season coming, where we're going to see co-infections, and people really need to get vaccines for influenza. I would recommend it. Everybody does. So things are going to get more complicated, but it doesn't mutate like flu in our view. And so at least in that regard, we don't have to keep changing the vaccines as long as they're good vaccines. That's my view.
And also probably the time advance for, because people forget the flu vaccine is really a guess. You actually have to guess what mutations are going to happen and kind of put something together, and often 2 years in advance, in order to actually produce them. So, and that's the part of it. And so hopefully, and thank God that all the indication is that it doesn't have that kind of rate of stuff, because if we have to then predict this thing 2 years in advance, then we're in trouble.
Yeah.
You're interested in tracking how the virus is mutating, there's a website called Next Strain that you can look at. That will tell you how it's mutating. And you can even start to look at, based on those strain breaks, how they differ. You can look at where the mutations are occurring. Is it on the spike protein? Is it on the envelope protein? Is it somewhere else? Is it likely to interfere with the viral function? There are all sorts of fun things that you can do if you want to really get deep into what's happening with the virus around the world.
Gabe, but is there any actionable information out of that? Like it's more infectious, there is more side effects, there's high chances of adverse effects, or just DNA code, RNA code, more or less?
So there are sources of RT-PCR sequences for coronaviruses. There may be even close to 100,000 out there now. So there is actionable information. It's being published in research. So you couldn't look at a chart and say directly on that chart at Next Strain, this strain of coronavirus is more infectious, or this one is more deadly potentially. All the research so far is pointing to differences in how infectious the disease is. But based on where those variants are, based on there is the potential, and we've had someone in our community pair that data with the host data, with age and comorbidities and things like that, and have found differences in patient outcomes that are statistically significant. So we don't know yet, right? We obviously, that's not peer reviewed. We have to make sure that we go through a process of diligence before that gets published. But if you want to go nuts on arXiv or bioRxiv, absolutely go out there. There are 70,000 papers that are waiting for you to read them.
Yes.
Awesome. Anyone have anything else to add? Okay, well, so I think we can wrap up a few minutes early. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the panelists for taking time to talk about your companies and the work you're doing. Just a quick, a few announcements. We're gonna host a members only happy hour in September. And then following that, we are partnering with another group at UCLA to host another panel in October. So these dates will be on our website. So the panel will be focused on female entrepreneurs, and we're co-hosting it with the Women in Philanthropy group. So if you enjoyed this panel, tune into the next one, and you can check our updates on social media and on our website. And then I will ask the panelists to send us any information that we can share with the participants, any links or more information on their companies. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
It's very nice to meet everybody.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.